"We win," he asked, eyes wide, heart innocent. I hugged him tightly, my chest swelling with something deeper than victory. "No, sweetheart," I whispered. "We didn't win. We found justice. My name is Lillian Monroe, and I never imagined that after decades of sacrifice for my family, I would stand alone at my husband's funeral, disrespected, dismissed, and betrayed by my own son-in-law. But this is the story of how I reclaimed my dignity and quietly restored my family. I always thought the quietest place in the world was our front porch at sunset, when Frank would sit beside me, his hand resting over mine, and the wind would stir through the old oak trees like a soft hymn. But I was wrong. The quietest place I've ever been was the front pew of Grace Lutheran Church in our little Tennessee town on the day I buried the only man who ever truly saw me. Frank Monroe wasn't a man of many words. He never needed to be. 51 years of marriage taught me to read the tilt of his head, the flicker of his smile, the way his calloused hand would give mine a little squeeze when words would only get in the way. And now here I was, sitting alone while a sea of polite faces surrounded me offering their rehearsed condolences, none of which could touch the empty ache sitting like a stone in my chest. The stained glass windows cast patches of colored light along the aisle. Reds, blues, soft greens danced across the wooden floor. But to me, the whole church smelled like grief. Frank loved lilies, but on that day their sweetness made me nauseous. 51 years together, and now I was here without him in the same church we got married in, holding nothing but a damp handkerchief and a heart that felt like it had been hollowed out. I felt a gentle hand on my wrist. "You holding up honey?" asked my neighbor, sweet old Mrs. Hargrove, who had known Frank since they were both in pigtails and scrappy little knobby-kneed kids. I nodded, but it was a lie. I wasn't holding up. I was sinking. Quietly, politely, just like every Southern woman was taught to do, as the pastor droned on about Frank's life, his time in the military, his years fixing engines, his faith, his kindness. I let my eyes drift to the side entrance, and that's when I saw them. Clara, my only daughter. My heart used to beat extra proud whenever I said her name. She used to be my baby girl, the one who pressed daisies into books, who begged Frank to teach her how to change a tire before her 16th birthday. And now she barely looked like the girl I raised. She walked in late, her head held two high, dark glasses covering her eyes, even inside the church. Her arm was tucked into the elbow of her husband, Mason Bell. That name tasted bitter in my mouth, even when I didn't speak it out loud. I hadn't seen Mason once during the final months of Frank's life, not when the hospital called, not when hospice came, not even on the days when the house was so quiet I could hear my own breathing bounce off the walls. Clara used to call me every evening, but after she married Mason, those calls became monthly, then quarterly, and sometimes not at all. They walked in like they were attending a business conference, not a funeral. Mason's suit was crisp, his hair perfectly styled, and Clara, well, she looked like someone who belonged anywhere but here. My heart gave a strange tug. Frank had always said, "Don't judge too fast, Lil. Sometimes sorrow wears a hard mask." So I pressed my lips together, pushed the hurt aside, and told myself they were grieving in their own way, until I heard Mason's voice. It happened after the pastor wrapped up his eulogy, after old friends and neighbors had sniffled and sighed. It happened when I stood up, every bone in my 72-year-old body aching to walk up to Frank's flag-draped casket and place my hand on the smooth, polished wood one last time. The room had settled into a hush, only the creaks of pews and the soft shuffle of shoes breaking the silence. Then Mason, standing just behind me, muttered loud enough for at least the 3 rows around him to hear. 50 years together. But where was the love these last few years? You can fake tears, but you can't fake a happy marriage. It sliced through the silence like a rusted blade. I stopped breathing for a second, my fingers tightening against the casket, steadying myself. I didn't turn around. I didn't make a scene. That wasn't my way, but I felt it. Every pair of eyes shifting toward me, every whispered gasp, every subtle shift of weight from foot to foot. I stood there, heart pounding so hard I thought it might split open on the church floor. Clara didn't shush him. She didn't correct him. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, arms crossed, lips pressed into a line, her husband standing beside her like a smug little boy, proud of kicking over someone else's sandcastle. The pastor cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to steer things back to his closing prayer, but the damage was done. The air had shifted. The quiet sadness of the room was replaced by a tension so thick it made the lilies smell sharper, almost sickly sweet. I made my way back to my seat, head held high, refusing to let my legs wobble in front of the people who had known me for decades. I sat down, pressed my palm against my chest, and stared straight ahead as the pastor fumbled through his closing words. I wanted to crumble. I wanted to turn around and ask my own daughter if she really thought so little of me. If she had forgotten the nights I rocked her to sleep while Frank worked double shifts. If she remembered who sewed her prom dress by hand or who stayed up teaching her algebra when her father's patience ran out. But I said nothing, because I wasn't going to ruin Frank's funeral the way they already had. The pallbearers lifted the casket, carrying my husband out the church doors for the last time. The sunlight blinded me as I stepped outside, the fresh summer breeze playing with the hem of my black skirt. I watched the casket being lowered into the hearse, my heart breaking all over again. Clara and Mason brushed right past me, whispering among themselves. I caught snippets. Real estate agent, market value, splitting assets. And it made my stomach twist. They weren't mourning. They were counting. A soft voice interrupted my racing thoughts. Mrs. Monroe came the gentle tone of our family lawyer, Charles Bennett. He'd handled Frank's business affairs for more than 30 years, seen us through the lean years, the prosperous years, and now the closing chapter. Frank requested we do the will reading immediately after the burial. I know it's a lot, but he wanted everything settled. I swallowed the lump in my throat, nodded slowly, and looked back at the church. Inside that old chapel, the man I loved was gone. Beside me stood a daughter who barely recognized me, a son-in-law who saw me as nothing but an obstacle and a future that felt cold and unfamiliar. But somewhere deep inside, past the grief, past the anger, I felt something else. Frank had planned this. He'd always been quiet, always been steady, but he was never foolish. He knew me. He knew them. And as I stood there, the sunlight warming my aching bones, I realized something. They thought they'd reduced me to nothing but an old woman in black lace. They thought I'd crumble. They thought I'd stay quiet. But they forgot one thing. Frank never left me standing alone. Not in life, and certainly not in death. The sky was a brilliant blue. That afternoon, the kind of blue Frank always said was best for fishing. The kind that usually brought a sense of calm. But as I sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Charles Bennett, the man who had been our family's attorney for over 30 years, there was no calm to be found anywhere in me. My fingers rested on my lap, steady in appearance, but my heart thumped against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I wasn't sure if it was dread or quiet fury keeping me upright, but I knew Frank had a reason for all of this. He always had. Charles adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat. As per Mr. Monroe's express wishes, the will is to be read immediately after the funeral service in the presence of the closest family members. He glanced around the room, a neutral expression on his face, but I could see something in his eyes. Respect, maybe a touch of sadness. Frank had been more than a client to him. To my left sat my daughter Clara, legs crossed tightly, jaw-clenched eyes hidden behind those dark sunglasses she refused to take off even inside. She hadn't looked at me since we walked through the door. Beside her sat Mason Bell, her husband, my son-in-law by law but never by heart. His sharp suit, polished watch, and smug little grin made my skin crawl. He leaned back in his chair like he already knew how this was going to play out, like the money was practically in his pocket. Charles began reading, his voice steady, his words clear. To my beloved wife, Lillian Monroe. I leave the family home located at 211 Willow Creek Drive fully paid for and protected under her sole ownership. Additionally, she shall receive a monthly stipend of $5,000 from my personal accounts for the remainder of her life, adjusted annually for inflation. I inhaled slowly, keeping my hands calm, my face passive. The house had been our anchor, the one place Frank always wanted to protect, especially when the years began catching up with us. He used to say, "You should never have to worry about a roof over your head, Lil. Not after everything." Charles continued, his tone not shifting, even as I felt the atmosphere in the room tighten. To my daughter, Clara Monroe Bell. I leave the sum of $20,000, along with a handwritten letter enclosed separately. I heard it before I saw it. The sharp inhale from Clara, the soft gasp, like someone had reached into her chest and squeezed tight. Mason shifted uncomfortably, his jaw visibly locking. I kept my gaze forward, my spine straight. I knew my daughter was expecting more, much more. She'd grown up surrounded by comfort, watching her father work tirelessly, seeing the life we built from sweat and sacrifice. But Frank had never been one for blind sentimentality, especially after these last few years. Charles didn't pause. To my grandson, Lucas Bell. I leave an educational trust fund in the amount of $100,000 to be managed by Mr. Charles Bennett and Mrs. Lillian Monroe, ensuring the funds are used solely for his education, health care, and well-being. For the first time, my lip twitched in the barest hint of a smile. Frank hadn't forgotten Lucas. He hadn't blamed the boy for the actions of his parents. He wanted to safeguard his future, give him opportunities, regardless of the mess the adults in his life had created. And then came the part I was waiting for. The remainder of my estate, including all investments, retirement savings, insurance policies, and proceeds from my business holdings, are to be allocated to the Frank and Lillian Monroe Foundation, a charitable entity established to provide financial support for families affected by pediatric cancer and to fund cancer research initiatives. The room seemed to freeze. I could feel Mason's smugness evaporate in an instant, replaced by something far uglier. Disbelief followed by pure, undiluted rage. His chair creaked as he leaned forward, his voice rising before he could stop himself. "This is absurd," he snapped. This is some kind of mistake. You can't just skip over your own daughter." Charles didn't even blink. "It's not a mistake, Mr. Bell. Mr. Monroe was of sound mind during the preparation of his will. He passed every required cognitive assessment. There are video records, notarized documents, and multiple legal witnesses to validate the authenticity of this document." I turned my head just slightly enough to see the deepening shade of red creeping up Mason's neck. Clara sat stiffly, her jaw trembling, hands twisting in her lap. She hadn't said a word. She couldn't. Mason pushed his chair back, letting it scrape loudly against the hardwood floor. "This is theft," he barked. Frank was sick. He didn't know what he was doing. This is manipulation." Charles calmly closed the file in front of him and folded his hands. "Mr. Bell, you are welcome to contest the will through appropriate legal channels, though. I will advise you that Mr. Monroe left extensive documentation anticipating such claims, including a private letter addressing this exact concern." Mason's mouth opened, then closed, his fury tangling in his throat. He turned to Clara, expecting support, expecting her to rally beside him, but she remained frozen. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes darting between me, Charles, and the thick folder on the table. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I simply sat in silence because I knew Frank's decision wasn't driven by vengeance. It was driven by love, by his desperate hope that Clara would wake up before it was too late, that Mason's grip wouldn't be the thing that strangled her future. Charles cleared his throat one final time, his gaze settling softly on me. There's one more item, Mrs. Monroe. I raised an eyebrow slightly, feeling my heart shift under my ribs. Charles reached into his briefcase and pulled out a simple white envelope, sealed my name written in Frank's unmistakable scrawl. Beneath it, a smaller line of text, for Lillian, to protect Clara when she's ready. My throat tightened. I took the envelope with both hands, my fingers grazing the soft paper. I felt Clara's gaze burn against my profile, felt Mason's anger simmering beside her. Clara's voice finally cracked through the tension, weak but unmistakable. "Mom," she whispered, her tone frayed around the edges. I didn't answer. I stood envelope pressed to my chest and nodded politely to Charles. "Thank you for honoring my husband's wishes," I said quietly. But my voice didn't waver. Frank planned this carefully. There is no confusion here, only clarity. Clara blinked rapidly like she was waking up from a fog. Mason sat back, defeated, seething. As I stepped outside into the warm Tennessee air, the world felt a little lighter. The sky was still that brilliant fishing trip blue, the same Frank loved, and I knew in that moment he was still with me. Steering the boat, watching the horizon guiding me home. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I had my anchor, and in my hands I held the beginning of Clara's redemption, whether she knew it or not. I didn't open the envelope the first night. I placed it on my kitchen counter next to the old cookie jar Frank always loved, still half full of the oatmeal raisin cookies he used to sneak before dinner. I walked past it, circling it like it was something alive, something that might leap up and change my life the moment I touched it. In many ways, I suppose it already had. It wasn't until the next morning, after a restless night of pacing the halls and whispering to the quiet walls of our home, that I finally sat down at the kitchen table. I made a pot of black tea the way Frank liked it. No sugar, no milk, just strong and straightforward. My hands hovered over the envelope, hesitating for a moment longer before I finally broke the seal. Inside was a single brass key and a folded note in Frank's handwriting. Just seeing his letters made my chest ache. "For when you're ready," it said, "in the safe our bedroom closet." The safe. I'd nearly forgotten about it. Frank and I had used it years ago to store insurance documents, house deeds, the sorts of things you only opened during tax season. I hadn't touched it in at least 5 years. My feet felt heavy as I walked up the stairs down the hallway into the quiet bedroom that still smelled faintly of Frank's aftershave. The closet was just as we'd left it, neat, orderly. Frank was always meticulous. I knelt down, pressing the key into the lock of the small gray safe nestled between his old winter jackets and fishing tackle box. The door creaked open, and inside sat a thick manila folder with my name scrawled across the front. I pulled it out and carried it back to the kitchen like it weighed 1,000 pounds. When I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. The first few pages were bank statements, transfers made from Clara's joint account to a separate account under Mason's name. Month after month, year after year, the same pattern. Thousands of dollars moved quietly without Clara's signature, without her knowing. Luxury, purchases, withdrawals labeled as business expenses, but redirected to private investment accounts Mason controlled. I turned another page and there were credit card statements. Clara's name on the card, but the charges were not hers. High-end restaurants, she'd never visited luxury hotels in cities Clara hadn't stepped foot in, clothing stores she wouldn't be caught dead shopping at. I recognized the brands. Not because Clara ever bought them, but because Mason wore them proudly like some badge of importance. I kept going. There were printed emails, screenshots of text messages. I read conversations between Mason and some financial advisor messages where he joked about milking the Monroe name for all it's worth, where he dismissed Clara as naive, and me as old money waiting to be grabbed. My hands trembled. The next section was worse. Records of Mason's interference during Frank's illness. Notes Frank had written down, dates, times, brief comments that cut like a blade. Mason canceling Clara's planned visits. Bum? Mason telling Clara not to overstress herself with hospital trips. Mason acting like the dutiful husband while systematically pushing Clara farther and farther away from her own father. I sat back in my chair, breath hitching in my chest. This wasn't just greed. This wasn't just manipulation. This was betrayal. Betrayal that had stolen precious time from me and Frank. Betrayal that had stolen Clara's last months with her father. And worst of all, betrayal Clara didn't even realize had happened. I pressed my palm to my chest. Fingers curled against the thin fabric of my blouse, trying to steady my heart. Frank had known. He'd seen it all, and yet he'd stayed silent while he was alive. Why? My heart whispered the question I didn't want to ask. Then I found the last piece in the folder. A handwritten letter from Frank dated almost a year before his passing. My dearest Lil. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and there's something I need you to know. I watched it happen. How Mason twisted things. How Clara drifted further from you, from me. I watched, and it broke me in ways I couldn't put into words. But I didn't speak up. Not because I was weak, but because I knew Clara wasn't ready to hear it. I saw it in her eyes. The girl I raised would have fought me. She would have defended him, maybe even walked away from us altogether. I couldn't bear the thought of our final months being consumed by shouting matches and slammed doors. I couldn't take from you the peace of these quiet days, even as my time was running out. So I stayed quiet. Until now. I trust you to know when she's ready. I trust you to show her the truth without letting it consume you. I trust you to protect her when I can't. You always were the strongest of us, Lil. Stronger than you ever knew. I sat there for a long time staring at the letter, the weight of it pressing down on me. I felt every year of my life in that moment. Every wrinkle, every ache in my bones, every quiet Sunday morning spent waiting for a phone call that never came. It wasn't just Frank I'd lost. I'd lost my daughter long before I'd lost my husband. My kitchen felt too quiet. The walls seemed to close in the memories in every corner, mocking me. I thought back to the last Thanksgiving when Clara and Mason came late, left early, and barely looked me in the eye. I thought about the birthdays where Clara would send a text instead of stopping by, always too busy, always too tired. I thought about every time I picked up the phone and Mason's voice answered, cheerful but dismissive, telling me Clara couldn't talk just then. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. For a moment I felt foolish. Foolish for loving too hard, for trusting too blindly, for clinging to the hope that my family could hold together when it had been unraveling thread by thread for years. But then I straightened my shoulders. Frank had given me a mission, not revenge, not retribution. Protection. Protection for Clara. Protection for Lucas. And maybe even a little bit of protection for myself. A reminder that I wasn't imagining things, that I wasn't the crazy old woman Mason tried to make me out to be. I looked down at the pile of documents, at Frank's steady handwriting, at the undeniable proof. I wasn't going to confront them yet. No, Frank was right. Clara wasn't ready, but the day would come when her heart would crack just wide enough for the truth to slip through. And when that day came, I'd be ready. I carefully placed everything back into the folder, tucking the letter on top like a protective shield. I stood feeling the weight lift off my chest just a little, the ache settling into something steadier, quieter. I walked back to the safe and placed the folder inside, locking it away, but not forgetting it. Then I stood in our bedroom for a moment longer, my eyes lingering on Frank's old flannel shirts, the empty space where his boots used to rest, and I whispered softly into the quiet, "Thank you, Frank. You always knew." And in that moment, even with my heart broken in two, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Purpose. Because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Grief is strange. It doesn't just arrive with tears. It comes with quiet, with loneliness, with long stretches of empty hours when your body sits in one room but your mind drifts back to all the places you can't return. I thought I was finally finding my footing after the funeral, after the will reading, after the envelope Frank left me. I thought the hardest part had passed, but then the notifications started. At first I ignored them. I wasn't one to bury myself in Facebook gossip. I only kept my account to share pictures of Lucas on his birthdays, or to like the occasional photo of Harriet's garden blooms. I never thought my name would be plastered all over social media like a headline on a cheap tabloid. It started with Mason's post. A dramatic, carefully crafted paragraph written in the kind of wounded tone he had perfected so well. There was a picture of him and Clara standing outside the church, heads bowed as if mourning had physically broken them. He wrote, "Today was the hardest day of my life. My beautiful wife said goodbye to her father, a man she loved deeply, and yet, in the midst of our grief, we were betrayed. My wife's childhood home, stolen. Her inheritance, wiped out. Her own mother, the woman she trusted, took everything and left us with nothing but broken hearts." I sat on the edge of the bed, my phone shaking in my hands. Comments flooded beneath the post. People who had never even known Frank, people who didn't know me, strangers and distant acquaintances, all chiming in. How could a mother do this to her own child? Heartbreaking. Sending prayers your way. I always suspected she was cold. This just proves it. I scrolled further, my stomach twisting into knots tighter with every swipe. And there, right there, was Clara. Her name attached to a comment, a simple sentence that hit me harder than any scream could have. "Thank you for your support. This has been the worst betrayal of my life. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, believing the worst of me, fueling Mason's performance without even knowing the truth that sat locked in the safe just feet away from me." The tears came hard, burning, unforgiving. I pressed my hands to my chest, trying to breathe through the ache. Not just for the betrayal, but for how easily Clara had been pulled into Mason's web. She wasn't fighting back. She wasn't asking questions. She was standing beside him, letting him poison her heart further. I didn't respond. Not on the post, not through messages, not to the whispers that followed me when I walked to the grocery store or stopped at the gas station. I stayed silent because Frank's letter rang in my head louder than any gossip could. "Wait until she's ready." But that didn't mean I had to suffer in silence completely. One afternoon, as I sat on my porch, trying to focus on the blooming hydrangeas, instead of the venom spreading online, Harriet pulled up in her little blue hatchback. She didn't knock. She never had to. She knew her way through my front door like it was her own. She appeared on the porch with 2 mugs of sweet tea and a little plate of lemon cookies. "You look like you need this," she said, settling herself in the chair next to mine. I managed a small, hollow laugh. "That obvious, huh?" She glanced at my phone sitting on the table, the screen still glowing from the last cruel comment I had tortured myself by reading. "I saw it," Harriet said gently. "And I saw Clara's comment, too." I swallowed down the lump rising in my throat, forcing my voice to stay calm. "It feels like I've lost her completely. Like Mason's taken every piece of her and turned it against me." Harriet didn't sugarcoat things. That's what I loved about her. She patted my hand, eyes steady. "He's a manipulator, Lil. A textbook one. And right now he's winning the loud game." "But you don't have to play it." I shook my head, my shoulders sagging. "People think I'm a monster. They think I stole from my own child. I've never been anything but a good mother. I stood by her even when she forgot we existed." Harriet squeezed my hand tighter. "I know who you are. Frank knew who you were. And someday Clara will remember too. But this, all this online noise, it's a show. Don't get sucked into it." I looked out over the porch railing, eyes landing on the garden Frank and I had built together. So what am I supposed to do? Just sit here while Mason drags my name through the dirt? No. Harriet said, her voice firmer now. "You hold your line. You don't get in the mud with him. You don't argue on Facebook like some angry teenager. You stay quiet where it counts. And you prepare." I turned my head, brow furrowing. "Prepare for what?" For the moment Clara starts to see the cracks, Harriet said simply, "Because they always show. Men like Mason. They get greedy, they get careless, and they get ugly. You'll be ready to show her the truth when the time comes, and when you do, you'll have more than words. You'll have proof." My heart steadied a little. The truth wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a rumor. It was there locked away in black and white. No amount of Facebook drama could erase that. I took a sip of tea, feeling the familiar comfort of it slide down my throat. The house was quieter than ever, but something shifted inside me. A spark, small but alive. "You're right," I said softly. "Frank didn't gather all that for nothing. He knew it would come to this." Harriet smiled, leaning back in her chair. "Exactly. You don't chase after people who aren't ready to listen. You wait until they knock on your door." I glanced down at my phone one last time, watching the flood of comments continue. Mason basking in the glow of his manufactured sympathy. I pressed the power button, shutting it off. Let them talk, I thought. Let them have their moment. Because when the dust settled, the truth would still be standing. I looked up at Harriet, my voice steadier. "I'm not going to respond to any of it." "Good," she said, popping a lemon cookie into her mouth. "Because you're not here to fight back. You're here to protect your family, even when they don't realize it yet." I smiled for the first time in days. The world could spin, the gossip could swirl, Mason could celebrate his little victories online. But I wasn't playing their game. I was playing Frank's. And Frank always knew how to win the long game. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Clara showed up. Not a phone call, not a text. Just the sound of her car tires crunching on the gravel driveway, the slam of a car door, and footsteps approaching my front porch. I stood in the kitchen, frozen for a moment, fingers still wrapped around the handle of my teacup. My heart wasn't sure whether to break or beat faster. The last time Clara came here unannounced, she was 19, furious over some curfew, stomping up the porch steps to tell me how unfair I was. That was a lifetime ago. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and headed to the door, steadying myself before I opened it. There she stood. Clara. Her hair pulled back too tightly, dark sunglasses shielding her eyes, dressed in that way Mason always preferred, expensive blazer-fitted jeans, high-heeled boots that didn't belong in a small Tennessee town. She wasn't looking at me. Her gaze lingered somewhere past my shoulder, like she was already planning her exit. "Mom," she said flatly. "Clara," I replied, keeping my voice even. I stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in." She hesitated for a moment, like crossing that threshold would burn her feet. But then she walked in, her perfume trailing behind her. Sharp cold, a scent I didn't recognize. I led her into the living room where the afternoon sun poured through the sheer curtains. The room felt warm, familiar. Clara sat on the edge of the couch like she didn't want to get too comfortable. I stayed standing, knowing whatever brought her here wouldn't be softened with small talk. She didn't waste time. "I want to talk about the house," Clara said, her lips tight, her tone clipped. "Mason and we've discussed it. It doesn't make sense for you to stay here alone. It's too big, too much upkeep." I nodded slowly, letting her speak. "We thought," she cleared her throat, "it would be better if you sold it. You could downsize to something more manageable. The money from the sale could, well, it could help rebalance things. Dad's will." Her voice faltered slightly, but she pushed through. "It wasn't fair. We could split the proceeds. Everyone gets something." I kept my expression calm, my hands resting gently against my thighs. "And by everyone," I asked softly, "you mean you and Mason?" Her jaw twitched and she crossed her arms defensively. "You're comfortable, Mom. You've got the monthly stipend. This house. It's more than you need. You don't even use the upstairs anymore." I sat down in the armchair opposite her, crossing one leg over the other, speaking with the steadiness Frank had always admired in me. "I see." Clara exhaled impatiently, pulling her sunglasses off and tossing them onto the coffee table. Her eyes. eyes that used to light up when she'd run through the sprinkler as a little girl, were hard now guarded. "I'm not here to fight with you," she said, trying to sound reasonable. "I'm just saying, this could help ease a lot of tension. If you'd be willing to reconsider the will, maybe we could talk to Mr. Bennett, see if there's a way to adjust things." I studied her for a long moment, letting the weight of her words settle. Then quietly I stood up. "Come with me," I said. Clara frowned. "Where upstairs?" She rolled her eyes but followed, clicking up the steps in those ridiculous boots. I led her to my bedroom, to the closet, to the little gray safe tucked behind Frank's old jackets. I bent down, unlocked it with the brass key Frank had left me, and pulled out the folder that had waited patiently for this very moment. Back downstairs, I placed it on the coffee table in front of her. "What's that?" she asked, skeptical. "Your father's last truth," I answered softly, sitting back in my chair. She huffed, flipping the folder open like she expected a family recipe or old insurance policies. But as the pages turned, her posture began to shift. The first page, bank statements. Clara's name on the account, but thousands siphoned into a separate account under Mason's name. Her brows furrowed. She turned another page. Credit card bills, luxury items she'd never purchased, trips she never took. Her breathing grew uneven. She flipped faster now, fingers trembling, emails printed out, messages from Mason to some financial advisor joking about keeping the little woman busy while the big boys handle the accounts. Her mouth parted slightly, shock creeping into her features. Then came the screenshots of text messages between Mason and some woman I didn't know. Flirty exchanges, dinners, booked hotel reservations, all while Clara had been home thinking her husband was working late. Her lips pressed together, her shoulders stiffening. The final section held Frank's notes, pages in his careful handwriting, documenting every phone call Mason intercepted every time Clara had tried to visit Frank in the hospital, only to be told Dad's resting or Mom's handling it all, orchestrated by Mason. Clara's face crumpled. Her hands shook as she pressed the papers down flat, rereading dates, accounts, receipts. Her chest rose and fell faster, like the walls of the room were closing in on her. I sat quietly, not needing to add a single word. Frank had already said enough. Tears gathered in Clara's eyes, defiance warring with devastation. She tried to swallow it down, tried to blink it away, but the dam had cracked. Her voice came out small, fragile. "Why? Why didn't you tell me?" I leaned forward, my own throat tightening. "Because you wouldn't have believed me, Clara. Your father knew it. I knew it. We watched and we waited, praying you'd see it yourself. But you were in too deep." Her head dropped, hands clutching the folder like it was an anchor keeping her from drifting into madness. A sob escaped her lips, raw, broken, painful. She pressed a hand over her mouth, the tears falling faster now, shoulders shaking. I moved from my chair, kneeling in front of her, taking her hands in mine. She didn't pull away. She broke. After years of distance, of cold phone calls, of empty holidays, my daughter cried in my arms, like she had when she was a little girl with scraped knees. "I didn't see it," she whispered through the sobs. "I didn't know." I held her tighter, brushing her hair back like I used to when nightmares woke her in the night. "You do. Now," I murmured, "and it's not too late." We stayed there for a long time, Clara sobbing into my shoulder, me holding her like the pieces of our family might just find their way back together. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. It was the first crack in Mason's perfect little illusion. And it was the first time in years my daughter let herself be a daughter again. When Clara came back 2 days later, she looked like a woman who'd stepped out of a burning house and hadn't yet realized she was safe. Her hands were trembling when I opened the door, her eyes puffy and red, her lips pressed together like she was holding back the flood of everything she'd just learned. She carried a single duffel bag, the strap digging into her shoulder. No suitcase, no car packed with belongings, just her standing on the porch like the little girl who used to run home after skinning her knee. I didn't ask questions. I just opened the door wider and let her in. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had served her peanut butter sandwiches and cut the crust off when she was 7, where I taught her how to make cornbread, where she sat in her prom dress while I fixed the zipper minutes before her date arrived. Now it was the quietest it had ever been, the air thick with everything unsaid. Finally, she spoke, her voice raw. "I told Mason I'm done." The words hung there, heavy, final. She shook her head. "I told him I want out. I told him I know everything, about the accounts, the lies, the way he—" Her voice cracked, "the way he kept me from Dad. From you. I said I wanted a divorce." My chest lifted with a breath that felt like it had been waiting for years. But then her shoulders hunched and her gaze fell to the kitchen table. He said, "If I leave, he'll take Lucas." My heart tightened. He said I'd lose custody. Clara whispered, her fingers curling into fists on the table. He threatened to drag me through court. Said he'd tell the judge I was unstable, that I couldn't support myself, that I'd poisoned Lucas against him. The fear in her voice was sharper than the anger had been. She wasn't afraid of losing money or status. She was afraid of losing her boy. I reached out and took her hand, feeling the cold in her fingers. "You're not losing your son," I said firmly. "Not to him. Not after everything." Clara blinked rapidly, her throat bobbing. "I don't even know where to start, Mom. I don't know how to fight someone like Mason." I gave her hand a little squeeze. "That's why you're not going to fight him alone." The next morning, we sat across from Charles Bennett in his downtown office, just like I had after the funeral. This time, Clara was at my side, quieter than I'd ever seen her. But there, not hiding, not running, Charles listened carefully, his pen tapping quietly against the notepad in front of him. When Clara finished telling him everything, every threat, every manipulation, he leaned back, eyes steady. "He's bluffing," Charles said simply. "Men like Mason, they use fear as their first weapon. But we have facts, documentation, financial records, emotional manipulation. We'll build your case, Clara." Clara bit her lip, uncertain. "What about Lucas?" Charles nodded. "That's our main focus. We'll file for temporary custody immediately. We'll submit all evidence showing Mason's financial exploitation and controlling behavior. If he tries to fight back, we'll request a court-appointed child advocate. You won't be painted as unstable Clara. You'll be seen as a mother trying to protect her child." For the first time since she walked into my house, I saw Clara breathe without shaking. Charles looked at me, giving me a small nod. "You'll be a key witness, Lillian, and your testimony about Mason's interference during Frank's illness. It matters." I nodded back. I had spent so many months feeling helpless, but now I felt something shift. We weren't waiting anymore. We were moving forward. After the meeting, we walked to the little diner down the street. I hadn't been there in years. Frank and I used to come here for pie on Sundays. The place hadn't changed. Same worn red booths, same chalkboard specials on the wall. We sat in the corner booth, Clara poking at her scrambled eggs, her appetite still gone. I didn't push. I just sipped my coffee and let the quiet sit between us like an old friend. After a while, she looked up, her expression softer than I'd seen in a long time. "Mom," she said, "it was simple. Just one word." But it was the first time in years she'd said it without bitterness, without distance, without that awkward formality that had crept into our relationship since Mason took root in her life. Mom. Not mother. Not Lillian. Just, Mom. My eyes stung. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. She blinked fast, her bottom lip wobbling. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. My throat tightened. "You don't have to apologize." "I do," she insisted, her voice thick. "I let him drive a wedge between us. I let him tell me things about you, about Dad. And I didn't question it. I didn't come see Dad when he was dying. I wasn't there for you. Her words broke into a sob. "I left you completely alone." I shook my head. "You were lost, Clara. You were trying to build a life, and you ended up with someone who knew exactly how to manipulate you. But you're back. That's what matters." Tears spilled over her cheeks. Do you think he'd forgive me?" I smiled, though my chest ached. "Your father believed in second chances more than anyone. He'd be proud of you. He'd be proud you finally saw through the lies, and he'd be proud you chose your son over everything else." Clara wiped her eyes, taking a shaky breath. "I thought I was too far gone," she said, "that I'd made too many mistakes to ever fix things." I squeezed her hand again, firmer this time. "You can always come home, Clara. That's what family is. You get lost, you fall down, but there's always a light on in the window." Her lips trembled, a tearful laugh escaping her. "You always said that when I was little, and I meant it then. I still mean it now." She took another deep breath, sitting a little straighter. "What if Mason fights back hard?" "Then we fight harder," I said. "But this time we fight smart. We have Charles, we have evidence, and most importantly, you have the truth. Mason's lies are built on sand. They'll crumble." Clara let out a slow breath, her shoulders releasing some of that tension that had been gripping them for years. "I don't know how I'm going to rebuild my life," she admitted. "One step at a time," I said quietly. "And you're not doing it alone." That night, Clara stayed at the house tucked into her old bedroom with the blue walls and faded posters of her high school idols still clinging to the plaster. I walked past her door before turning in, pausing just a moment to listen, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the house felt whole again. Maybe the healing had only just begun. Maybe there would be hard days ahead. But for that night, my daughter was home, and my grandson would be safe. I stood in the quiet, whispering to the stillness of the house. She found her way back, Frank, just like you said she would. And in the quiet, I could almost feel him smiling. My daughter was no longer lost, and I was still her safe harbor. The courthouse was colder than I expected. Maybe it was just my bones noticing things more these days, but sitting in that stiff-backed wooden bench, I felt it settle in my chest like a weight. I glanced over at Clara sitting beside me, her jaw tight, fingers laced together in her lap, and I knew she felt it too. The courtroom wasn't just cold, it was suffocating. This wasn't the first hearing. It wouldn't be the last. But it was the first day Mason showed his true colors in public, and somehow, even knowing what we knew, it still left a sour taste in my mouth. Across from us sat Mason, flanked by a new lawyer, slick-haired, sharp-suited, and smug as they came. The kind of man who thought spinning lies was an art form and winning was all that mattered. I recognized the strategy right away. Mason wasn't going to stay quiet like Clara. He wasn't going to show restraint or quiet dignity. No, he was going to shout. His lawyer stood up first, launching into a well-rehearsed speech about how Mason was a devoted father, how Clara was emotionally unstable, manipulated by her aging mother acting out of grief, punishing Mason because she couldn't process her own guilt about losing her father. I sat there stone-faced, feeling every word like a mosquito bite, annoying, meaningless, and bound to be swatted away soon enough. Clara didn't flinch, not once. She kept her eyes forward, shoulders back, as her attorney, Charles Bennett, calmly laid out our case. No dramatics, no raised voices, just the truth. He presented bank statements, financial records, text message transcripts, documentation of Clara being cut off from her father in his final days, and detailed the manipulative behaviors Mason had shown throughout the marriage. When Charles spoke, the courtroom shifted. You could see it. People leaning forward slightly, judges scribbling notes a little faster. The truth had a different rhythm. It didn't need to be loud to be heard. I watched Mason's jaw tighten as evidence after evidence stacked up against him. His confidence wavered, his fingers fidgeted, his foot tapped impatiently on the floor. But he wasn't going to give up easily. His next move wasn't inside these walls. It was outside in the digital world where facts could be bent and public opinion swayed with a few cleverly edited pictures and enough hashtags. The next morning, Clara woke me with a phone call from the next room. "Mom, check your Facebook," she said, her voice tired but steady. I didn't want to, but I did. Mason had posted a photo of Lucas clinging to him, eyes, red cheeks flushed, paired with a paragraph so drenched in self-pity it could have drowned a village. He wrote about being ripped away from his son, accused Clara of losing touch with reality, of being poisoned by family jealousy, and of alienating Lucas from the father who loved him most. It was a performance, a carefully staged performance, and it worked. The comments poured in, people who knew nothing about our family, declaring Mason a victim, calling Clara heartless, calling me manipulative. Clara didn't respond. Neither did I. We sat on the porch together that evening, sipping tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft oranges and purples. "You sure about this, baby?" I asked, my voice gentle. "You sure you don't want to set the record straight?" Clara shook her head, her hands firm around her mug. "We've got what matters, Mom. We've got the truth. I'm not fighting Mason in the comments section of the internet. I'm fighting him in court, where it counts." I smiled, then soft and proud. That was my girl again. Not the broken woman who came through my door weeks ago, but the Clara who used to stand up for herself, who once declared she'd be a veterinarian at 8 years old and didn't care what anyone thought. The next hearing came fast, and it hit Mason harder. Charles presented evidence of Mason's social media campaign screenshots of manipulated images, public posts bashing Clara, while the custody hearing was ongoing. The judge didn't like it. I could tell by the way his mouth twitched, by the way his pen paused mid-sentence. Then came the final nail. A court-appointed child specialist had visited Lucas at school, had watched his interactions with both parents. Her report was clear. Lucas was calm, happy, secure when he spoke about Clara. But when asked about Mason, his body tensed. His words stumbled. His drawings depicted Mason with a frown, with storms in the background, while his pictures of Clara showed sunny skies and smiles. Mason's lawyer tried to dismiss it, called it subjective, called it unfair. But the judge didn't flinch. The ruling came later that day, temporary primary custody awarded to Clara pending final proceedings. Mason was granted limited supervised visitation rights. The sound that escaped Mason's throat wasn't just anger. It was panic. Clara turned to me in the courthouse hallway, her hands shaking, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and relief. "We did it," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "I can protect Lucas." I pulled her into my arms, holding her tight, my own throat thick with emotion. Later that evening, Lucas came home. My sweet boy ran up the porch steps like he always used to, arms-wide backpack, bouncing against his little shoulders. "Grandma," he shouted, barreling into me like a rocket, knocking the air out of my lungs in the best possible way. I held him tight, kissed his cheeks, and didn't care that my tears landed on his hair. Clara stood a few steps back, her eyes shining, her smile trembling, but real. That night, for the first time in months, our house was filled with laughter. Lucas built blanket forts in the living room. Clara and I cooked spaghetti together like old times, and when bedtime came, Lucas begged me to read him one of Frank's old bedtime stories. I tucked him in, smoothing his hair back, my heart feeling fuller than it had in years. Before I turned off the light, Lucas grabbed my hand. "Grandma," he said, eyes wide. "Are we safe now?" I blinked back, tears squeezed his little hand. "Yes, sweetheart," I whispered. "We're safe now." But I knew the road wasn't over. Mason wasn't done. There would be appeals, more hearings, more lies spun into the wind. But I also knew this. We were standing tall. We were standing together. And no matter how loud Mason shouted, the truth spoke louder. I kissed Lucas goodnight, walked back down the hallway where Clara was waiting, and smiled. "This is just the beginning," I said softly. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like hope. The final hearing came faster than I expected. I guess when you hold your breath for too long, every moment feels like a lifetime, but somehow it all rushes toward you at once. Clara sat next to me in the courthouse that morning, dressed in a simple navy dress. Her hair pulled back, no jewelry, no makeup except for a soft sweep of powder to hide how little she'd been sleeping. She didn't need armor made of appearance anymore. She had the truth, and that was enough. Mason walked in with his new lawyer, the same one who had been throwing accusations at every wall since the first hearing. I could see the wear on him, though. His jaw clenched tighter, his gaze darting quicker, his suit a little more rumpled than before. The sparkle of arrogance had dulled, replaced with frustration, because nothing stuck the way they thought it would. The judge entered an older gentleman with kind but piercing eyes. He didn't look like a man who enjoyed dramatics, which was fortunate for us. I sat back silent, watching everything unfold while Clara took her place. This wasn't my courtroom battle. It was Clara's. But I was there steady as a rock behind her, just like Frank would have been. Her attorney, Mr. Bennett, stood tall, calm, and methodical as he walked through the months of evidence. He spoke about financial exploitation, about emotional manipulation, about the systematic effort Mason had made to isolate Clara from her family and control her access to her own child. The financial records were irrefutable. The text messages, the blocked phone calls, the fabricated excuses, it was all right there, presented without fanfare, just fact after damning fact. Then came the Guardian's report about Lucas. The way Mason had ignored Lucas's emotional needs, the anxiety Lucas showed after time with Mason, the calm he expressed when with Clara, the stable routines, the safe spaces. It was a relief hearing it spoken out loud, hearing the courtroom fill with the sound of Clara's truth. Mason's lawyer tried to spin it, of course. He tried to paint Clara as vengeful, claimed I had turned Clara against Mason after Frank's death, that I had manipulated everything to push Mason out of Lucas's life. He even tried to present social media posts, those same posts Mason used to stir sympathy online, but the judge waved them away, unimpressed. At one point, Mason stood up, his voice rising in frustration. "She's unstable. Her mother feeds her lies. This is a conspiracy to rob me of my son and my rightful share of the estate." The judge let him speak. Let him rant, and then silenced him with one simple wave of the hand. "Sit down, Mr. Bell," the judge said firmly. "This court isn't interested in theater. We are interested in the welfare of your child." When Clara stood up to give her testimony, my breath caught in my chest. She spoke slowly, carefully, but with a strength that hadn't been in her voice in years. She talked about her mistakes, not hiding from them, but acknowledging them. She admitted to losing herself for a while, to trusting the wrong person, to letting distance wedge itself between her and her parents. But then her voice wavered with emotion when she talked about her father, about the time she lost the moments stolen from her, the calls she never got to make because of Mason's interference. And when she spoke about Lucas, I saw the entire room lean forward. She talked about the simple things: reading bedtime stories, packing school lunches, teaching him how to ride his bike, the tiny ordinary moments Mason never cared about, but that made up the real core of being a parent. By the time she finished, there wasn't a single doubt in that room about who the safe parent was, who the loving parent was. When the judge finally spoke, it felt like the courthouse itself exhaled with me. He looked directly at Mason first. "Mr. Bell, the evidence before me shows a clear and troubling pattern of manipulation, financial misconduct, and disregard for your child's emotional well-being. Your behavior during these proceedings, both in court and publicly, further confirms the court's concerns." He paused, shifting his gaze to Clara. "Ms. Monroe, while the court acknowledges there have been missteps in your past, you have demonstrated sincerity, responsibility, and most importantly, an unwavering commitment to your son's welfare. This court believes Lucas's best interests lie with you." My fingers curled against the smooth wood of the bench, my chest swelling with a quiet, overwhelming relief. The judge continued, his tone steady. "Effective immediately, full legal and physical custody of Lucas Bell is awarded to Ms. Monroe. Mr. Bell will have supervised visitation rights contingent upon participation in parenting and counseling sessions. Furthermore, the court imposes financial restitution regarding prior misuse of marital funds to be assessed in a separate hearing. I closed my eyes for just a second, letting Frank's memory wrap around me like a soft blanket. We had done it. Clara had done it. As we left the courtroom, the hallway felt wider, the air warmer. Clara moved beside me, shoulders straighter, her steps lighter. We walked through the doors together, and there waiting with Harriet was Lucas. His little legs kicked at the carpet, his backpack slung over one shoulder, hair slightly messy like it always got after school. The second he saw Clara, he took off running, his little arms pumping, his voice echoing through the hall. "Mommy!" he shouted, crashing into her waist, wrapping his arms tight around her. She knelt down, scooping him into a full embrace, tears rolling down her cheeks, pure joy breaking across her face. And then Lucas looked up, those big brown eyes glinting, his voice full of childlike wonder and excitement. "Grandma." He grinned. "We won, didn't we?" I felt my throat tighten, my heart full but fragile. I walked over, knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "No, sweetheart." I whispered, my voice calm, steady. "We didn't win. We found justice. There's a difference." Lucas tilted his head in that curious way kids do, but then smiled wide anyway, content with the feeling of happiness, even if he didn't understand the words just yet. Later that evening, we sat around my kitchen table, just the three of us. Spaghetti boiled on the stove, garlic bread warmed in the oven, and the house buzzed again. Not with fear, but with peace. Clara looked over her shoulder while Lucas colored in the corner. "Do you think it's really over, Mom?" she asked, her voice cautious but hopeful. I sipped my tea, feeling that quiet calm settle in my chest. "Maybe not completely," I answered honestly. "There'll be papers to sign, a few more court dates, final settlements. But the hardest part," I smiled softly, "that's over. You took your life back. And Lucas has his mother." Clara blinked quickly, brushing away the tears she hadn't realized were forming. "We didn't just survive, Clara," I whispered, my voice catching. "We reclaimed what was ours." And in the soft glow of the kitchen light, with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of crayons scraping across paper, I knew we weren't just healing. We were whole again. Life didn't snap back into place like a rubber band. It unfolded softly, almost cautiously, like spring after a harsh winter. I knew enough about grief and forgiveness to understand nothing healed overnight, especially when the wounds had been cut so deep. But in the quiet days that followed the final hearing, something beautiful began to happen. A slow, gentle restoration of family. Clara moved into the house, at least for the time being. At first she insisted it was temporary, just until the dust settled. But I could see it in her eyes. There was comfort here, familiarity in these walls. She hadn't felt that in years. She took over the guest room across the hall from Lucas, helped me tend to the garden. Frank had joined me on early morning walks through our little neighborhood. Her steps were hesitant in the beginning, like she was unsure whether she deserved peace after everything that had happened. But I made it my quiet mission to show her she did. Every day was proof that there was life after heartbreak, that family could be mended with small stitches. One morning over a cup of coffee, Clara sat across from me at the kitchen table, turning an envelope in her hands. Her voice was softer now, free from the defensiveness it once held. "I've been thinking about the foundation," she said, glancing up. "The one Dad left behind." I leaned back, watching her closely. I'd been waiting for this, patiently letting her come to it on her own terms. "He started it for a reason," I replied, voice steady. "To help people. To leave something good behind." Clara's lips tugged into a small smile, a hint of the girl I used to know shining through. "I want to be part of it. I want to help run it. Properly, responsibly." Warmth spread through my chest. Frank would have been proud of her, I knew it. He'd always hoped Clara would remember her heart. Remember that giving back was part of our family's values. So that afternoon we sat down with Charles Bennett. I officially added Clara as co-trustee of the Frank and Lillian Monroe Foundation. Watching her sign the paperwork, I felt something unexplainable settle inside me, like a balance had been restored. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about legacy on paper. It was about trust. Trust that my daughter had returned to herself. Trust that our family's name would stand for something meaningful again. Later that week, Clara stood in the living room, hands on her hips, a grin playing on her face. Lucas sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through colorful balloons and plastic tableware spread out around him. "Mom, are you sure about this?" she asked, laughing. "We haven't thrown a birthday party together in years." I chuckled, kneeling beside Lucas to help untangle a streamer. "First time for everything, Clara. Besides, every 8-year-old deserves a proper birthday bash, and I intend to make sure Lucas has one to remember." We planned everything ourselves. Homemade decorations, a cake baked from scratch games set up in the backyard. Clara wanted to keep it simple, and I agreed. No hired event planner, no over-the-top entertainment, just family, a few close friends, and a day filled with laughter. When the day came, the house was alive in a way I hadn't felt in so long. There were children's giggles echoing through the backyard, bright balloons bouncing in the breeze, the smell of chocolate cake drifting from the kitchen. Clara stood beside me as we lit the candles, her smile wide and real. Lucas's face glowed in the candlelight, his little hands clasped in excitement as we all sang. I felt my throat tighten, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. There was no bitterness here, no shadow of Mason lurking around the edges of our celebration. Just love, just family. Clara leaned over her shoulder, brushing mine. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered, her eyes glassy but happy. "Thank you for sticking by me, for letting me come home." I squeezed her hand, my voice low but certain. There was never any other option. "You're my daughter. You always have a home here." The rest of the afternoon was simple joy. Lucas chasing his friends around the yard, Clara and I sipping sweet tea on the porch, sunlight catching in our hair. It wasn't extravagant, but it was everything we needed. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. Clara took on more responsibilities with the foundation, attending meetings with Charles, organizing community outreach projects. She started volunteering at the local children's hospital, reading to young patients, bringing smiles to faces that had seen far too much sadness. Every evening we'd sit around the kitchen table sharing stories from our day. Lucas would excitedly recount his school adventures. Clara would talk about the foundation's progress, and I just listened, heartful, grateful to have my family whole again. One evening as we cleared the dishes, Clara paused by the window watching Lucas chase fireflies in the fading light. "I never thought it'd feel like this again," she said quietly. Peaceful, normal. I joined her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It's the little things, Clara. It always has been. The big moments matter, sure, but it's the quiet evenings, the birthday parties, the everyday smiles that build a life." She nodded, her eyes soft. "I want to protect this, to protect him, and to protect us, and I knew she would." I knew deep in my bones that the woman standing beside me had rediscovered her strength. She wasn't the same Clara who'd walked into my house weeks ago broken and ashamed. She was rebuilding herself brick by brick, choosing love over resentment, grace over bitterness. Lucas darted into the house, cheeks flushed from playing, holding out a tiny glass jar with a single glowing firefly inside. "Grandma, look," he beamed. "It's magic!" Clara laughed, ruffling his hair, and I smiled as I unscrewed the jar lid. "It sure is, baby," I said, "but let's let the magic fly free." We opened the jar, watching the little light blink into the evening sky. And in that moment I realized this was what rising from the ashes looked like. Not dramatic, not loud, just soft, steady healing. One quiet, golden evening at a time. A year passes quicker than you expect. People always told me time heals everything, but I've learned it's not time. It's what you do with it. It's how you choose to wake up every morning, how you decide to hold on to love instead of bitterness. Sitting on my front porch now, I finally understand that. It was spring again, warm and gentle. The dogwoods were blooming. The air smelled like fresh grass, and the birds never seemed to stop singing. I rocked slowly in Frank's old chair, the same one that had sat out here for decades, weathered but sturdy. My fingers traced the armrest, remembering the way his hand would rest there, his wedding ring tapping softly while we watched the world drift by. I missed him. Of course I did. I missed the way his laugh could fill a room, the way he grumbled every time the lawnmower wouldn't start, the way he used to squeeze my hand twice before falling asleep. But there were no sharp edges to the grief anymore. No stabbing pain in my chest. No suffocating silence. Just warmth. Just quiet, steady love that had settled in my bones, carrying me through the days. Behind me, through the open windows, I could hear Lucas's laughter. He'd just come home from school, a bundle of energy, already tossing his backpack to the side and chattering away to Clara in the kitchen. "Grandma?" he called out, voice bright and full of pride. "I got an A on my science project." I smiled wide, my heart tugging in that familiar way only a grandchild can make it tug. I stood up from the rocker and walked inside. Lucas ran over, waving his graded paper like a trophy. Clara followed, carrying a tray of lemonade, her face glowing with pride. She looked so different now. Lighter, freer, like someone who had finally exhaled after holding their breath for too long. "That's amazing, sweetheart," I said, wrapping Lucas in a big hug. "I knew you'd do great." It was about butterflies. Lucas grinned, and I remembered what you told me, Grandma, about how they change and come out stronger. I blinked back happy tears. "That's right, baby. Sometimes change is the best thing in the world." Clara poured us all lemonade sitting down across from me at the kitchen table. Lucas was the only one in his class who used real photos from the backyard. His teacher was so impressed. I watched them, mother and son, whole and happy. Frank would have loved this. He would have teased Lucas about the messy handwriting, clapped him on the back, told him stories about caterpillars from his boyhood days. And he would have looked at Clara, pride shining in his eyes, knowing his girl had found her way back. Clara had changed in more ways than I could count. She spent her mornings working with the foundation building on what Frank had started, expanding scholarships, organizing fundraisers. But it was her afternoons that made me the proudest. Volunteering at the Women's Center downtown, helping women who had lived through manipulation, through betrayal, through the kinds of storms Clara herself had survived. She came home every evening tired but fulfilled, Lucas running into her arms, stories bubbling up about his day. And every night we sat down together for dinner, laughter bouncing off the kitchen walls. That evening after dinner, I sat in my bedroom going through the little wooden box where I kept Frank's letters. There, nestled under old photos and faded postcards, was the envelope I had saved for last. The one that had waited for me all year. "For when you're smiling again," it said in his handwriting. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it, unfolding the single piece of paper inside. My Lillian. If you're reading this, it means the worst has passed. You survived the storm just like I always knew you would. You always were the strongest one between us, even if you never saw it. You were the roots of this family. Quiet, steady, and unshakable. I hope you've taken the time to breathe again, to look up at the sky and see the beauty in the clouds instead of the weight of them. I hope you've laughed with Lucas, shared quiet talks with Clara, and reminded yourself every day that love didn't leave this house when I did. Promise me you'll live the way you always dreamed, without fear, without regret. Smile when you think of me. Know that every good thing you do keeps me alive in all the right ways. You were my home, Lil. You always will be. All my love. Frank. I pressed the letter to my chest, tears sliding down my cheeks, but they were soft tears, the kind that healed instead of wounded. I whispered, "I miss you, Frank, but I'm okay now. The next morning, Clara and I sat on the porch, sipping coffee, Lucas playing catch in the yard with our neighbor's dog. I signed up for another workshop at the Women's Center, Clara said. Teaching financial independence. I wish I'd known all this back then. But maybe it's not too late to help others. It's never too late, I said softly. You're building something that matters, Clara. Something that makes a difference, she smiled. You taught me that, Mom. You didn't just give me a second chance, Famo. You showed me how to build a better life from the pieces. Lucas ran over cheeks, flushed hair messy. A grin stretched from ear to ear. Can we have pancakes for dinner? Grandma? I laughed. Why not? Pancakes are always a good idea. That night we gathered around the table again. Clara, Lucas, and me. Eating pancakes, telling silly stories, making memories in the same home where so many old memories lived. And I realized something simple but powerful. I had lost a husband, but I hadn't lost my family. Frank's chair at the head of the table sat empty, but his presence filled the room. In the way Lucas laughed, in the way Clara stood taller, in the way I smiled without hesitation. The house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt alive. It felt safe. It felt like home. And I knew deep in my bones this was Frank's true legacy. Not the money, not the foundation, not even the well-written will. His real legacy was us, the people who stood back up after falling, who healed after breaking, who loved each other enough to rebuild. As the evening settled around us, I looked at my daughter, my grandson, and I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I had survived. We had survived. And now we were living. ChatGPT said, "Thank you for staying with me through this journey. Have you ever felt like life knocked you down only to find strength in the most unexpected places? Have you ever had to rebuild yourself after being broken by the very people you trusted? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share your own story, because sometimes just telling it out loud helps more than we realize. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on the notification bell. Here we share stories about strength healing and quiet dignity, stories that remind us it's never too late to stand tall again. Your next story is just a click away.